For just about every business IT environment these days, Active Directory has become an almost indivisible part of the Microsoft Windows experience. And what's curious about that is that Active Directory is by no means a required part of that experience. In fact, Active Directory is not necessary in Windows environments. It's completely optional. And I've worked with businesses before, even some large organizations, that have managed to operate without an Active Directory presence. But those businesses tend to be sort of the one-offs. They may be very small. They may be the exception to the rule. The reason for that is because Active Directory, as a completely free feature in the Windows Server operating system, is something that most organizations very quickly recognize that they need. You can run a bunch of machines in a work group for a pretty reasonable period of time, but as the number of machines gets much beyond just a handful, the need to consolidate them together, their permissioning, their authentication, their authorization, the need to have a central location where all of those things get aggregated becomes very important. And it is for that reason that you see Active Directory in just about everywhere these days. Well, what may surprise you for a technology that is so mission critical that Active Directory in MCSE generations gone past was quite a bit more heavily tested on in the variety of different tests that you were required to take. These days, Active Directory gets one objective in a long list of those that include other things like file and file services and installing Windows and so on. And even as you move through to the other tests in your MCSA or MCSE exploration, you'll find that Active Directory is not the most important thing that you'll be working with. That may be in part to the fact that Active Directory is already everywhere, and so the number of people that have an opportunity to create a production Active Directory infrastructure from scratch is just simply getting less and less because those opportunities don't necessarily present itself. As a consequence, what you'll find here in this objective, and then all the other AD-related objectives that follow in all the tests that follow, that the very foundations of Active Directory are perhaps a little less important than knowing what to do with it once it's in place. Now, if you're just joining us here, this is our learning path for the 70-410, the first in the MCSA curriculum. And this is number 4 in a long list of 7 different courses that we've put together that make up all the different content for that 410 exam. We began first with a look at the MCSA and the 70-410 exam itself, and very specifically on the R2 version of this exam. Everything we'll be dealing with here in this learning path has to do with that extra content that exists with the release of Windows Server 2012 R2. We then took a look at installing and configuring servers, some of the very manual ways in which you can get servers installed, and then some of the PowerShell and command line ways in which you can get them configured. And then Jason took a look at the deployment and configuration of core network services. These are things like DNS and DHCP, as well as a fairly extended review of just how you get servers and services on the network via IPv4 or IPv6. It is that prerequisite that takes us here to our discussion on installing and administering Active Directory. And it's here where I will freely admit Jason and I had to kind of determine which order these last 2 courses needed to go in, because in order to have Active Directory, you have to have DNS services. And in some cases, in order to have DNS and DHCP services, you had to have Active Directory. So you'll find Jason back on that last course, and then me here in this course, kind of waving our hands in the air when it comes to a couple of the prerequisites that are required in order to get these things up and running. So please bear with us if we seem to be jumping around just a bit. Here in this course, we have 3 different topics we have to talk about, each one mapping to one of the objectives in the 410, the first of which is to install domain controllers. And what's interesting about installing domain controllers is that even today in Server 2012 R2, the steps to do so, although are fairly highly automated, still require a couple of prerequisites. There's still a couple of gotchas you just have to be aware of when it comes time to install your first, or maybe not your first, ADDC. We'll go through what those are. I'll show you the different ways in which you can install a domain controller, both using the graphical user interface as well as at the command line. And then from there, we'll talk about how you can create and manage your Active Directory users and computers. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, well, gosh, Greg, are we really going to go through the process to right-click and create a new user or a new computer? Well, sort of, I guess. But more importantly these days, and particularly with this current generation of the MCSA and MCSE, knowing how to perform these tasks not only from the user interface, the graphical user interface, but also from the command line is perhaps a little bit more important. So we'll talk about not only how to create users and computers, but some of the bulk and automated ways in which you can accomplish the same tasks via the command line and via scripting. We will then conclude with a third module and objective here on creating and managing Active Directory groups and organizational units. In this third module, we'll take a look at the different groups that are out there, how they can interrelate, as well as the organizational units, what they're used for, and how best to use them. It is this foundation that will get our environment ready to go for the implementation of a variety of different network services that Jason will talk about in the course following. These will be things like file services and print and document services and so on. All of those additional services are ones that make a lot more sense once you have an Active Directory infrastructure in place and all the users and computers and groups and OUs that populate that Active Directory. But for now, let's go ahead and go through the process of getting an Active Directory online and getting a couple of servers built into that environment. Coming up next, we begin that process with the installation of a domain controller and the creation of an Active Directory forest and domain. I will tell you that an Active Directory, in and amongst all the different components that make it work, has a lot of different pieces that connect together. And whereas the tasks that the exam tests you on may be a little disconnected from the academics or the terminology for those components, we'll start with the foundations and take a look at those components individually so we can see where they interconnect together to create this experience that is our Active Directory infrastructure. And then from there, we'll go through the click-by-click and step-by-step process you'll go through to implement Active Directory, your very first domain controller, and then all the other domain controllers after that. All that and more is the topic for our next module coming up.